Thank you very much, Ambassador Shah, and can I say at the outset how delighted I am to be back in India and particularly pleased to be making my first visit to this university, and I do want to thank the Chancellor and the other staff of the university for their kind invitation to be with you today. I want to spend my time giving you an Australian perspective on Indian Ocean issues. Not an official Australian perspective because I'm no longer an official, but a personal view about how we in Australia see the Indian Ocean, particularly the geostrategic currents, and in particular how we approach the concept of the Indo-Pacific. I want to talk a bit about how this Indo-Pacific concept shapes the way Australia views India in geopolitical terms, including the growing strategic congruence between our two countries. Now, it's not often that a country changes the geographic definition of its primary strategic environment, but that's precisely what Australia has done in recent years by replacing the Asia-Pacific with the Indo-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific, with East Asia at its centre, had been the conceptual foundation of Australian strategic thinking for most of the period since the Second World War. It was seen as a strategic, coherent system, bringing in the major powers and also reflecting a very long period of trade and investment integration across the Asia-Pacific, something which incidentally distinguishes the Asia-Pacific from the Indian Ocean region. Australia saw this economic integration as giving the Asia-Pacific added coherence. It was a construct which provided a framework for thinking about the management of major power relationships, anchored in US strategic primacy, and it was also our frame of reference for charting the strategic impact of shifting economic weight, especially the rise of the Chinese economy since the early 1970s. In more recent years, however, we have moved from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific to describe the boundaries of our strategic environment, and a large part of that shift is driven by how we see India. Now, I should concede at the outset that the concept of the Indo-Pacific as a single strategic system is very much a work in progress and very much the early days of a work in progress. It is both an act of imagination and a recognition of an emerging structural shift in our strategic environment. At its heart, the Indo-Pacific reflects two propositions. First, that the maritime environment is likely to be the primary focus of strategic planning and strategic competition over the next several decades. And second, that India's strategic focus will, over this period, shift well beyond India's immediate neighbourhood and embed India in the strategic dynamics of the Asia-Pacific in a way that it has not in the post-war period. These two propositions do not in themselves create a coherent Indo-Pacific strategic system, but it does suggest that the idea of the Asia-Pacific needs to adapt to accommodate these two propositions. In this sense, the idea of the Indo-Pacific is best understood as an evolution of Australia's Asia-Pacific bearings, not a rejection of it. It's also important to understand what the Indo-Pacific is not. It does not, for example, treat the Indian and Pacific Oceans as a single strategic system, nor does it seek to bring all of South Asia into the old Asia-Pacific strategic system. For now, the Indo side of the Indo-Pacific is really just India, and it is more about bringing India to the Asia-Pacific than stretching the footprint of Australia's primary strategic focus all the way to the western reaches of the Indian Ocean. Over time, more structure and integration may evolve in the Indian Ocean, such that it might become a coherent strategic system akin to its counterpart in the Western Pacific. But that is, in my view, a very long way off. So for the foreseeable future, when we think about the Indo-Pacific, we are thinking of an Asia-Pacific which finds room to accommodate India as a strategic player, and an India whose strategic and economic interests will increasingly draw her into being such a player. The geoeconomic dynamics at play here are important because shifts in economic weight inevitably have large implications for strategic weight. We see this clearly with China, which is reaching not just for more strategic influence to match its economic weight, but in the longer term for strategic predominance in the Asia-Pacific. The biggest question about China is what will be its political and strategic settling point. How will the Chinese leadership hold on to its monopoly of political power, which it is determined to do, while also putting in place the far-reaching economic reforms it has itself identified as essential if the Chinese economy is to grow? How do you give the market a greater role in the allocation of resources while maintaining a tight grip on political control? I had always thought that the tensions between an economy which was opening up and a polity which was tightly controlled could be managed in the Chinese context for a very long time. Now, that may still prove to be the case, but it does seem to me that it is becoming harder for China to achieve. Much has been said of the challenges Australia faces as it manages its relationship with China and the US, respectively. I don't subscribe to the view that Australia will have to make some binary choice between the US and China. But as strategic competition between the US and China sharpens, and I think under a Trump administration it will, and if China continues to be dismissive of its international legal obligations in the South China Sea, it will inevitably become harder for Australia simultaneously to pursue our large economic interests with China and our core strategic interests with the US and in a rules-based system. We will not know for some time whether our objectives with China and its role in the region can be achieved, but it would be foolhardy to conclude now that they cannot. Nor does it help to cast China as the enemy. But China's behavior does challenge a strategic system and a strategic culture with which Australia is comfortable, both as a US ally and as a beneficiary of a rules-based system reflective of the norms of a liberal international order. And it means that the level of strategic congruence between Australia's strategic interests and China's strategic ambitions is fairly limited. India is a very different proposition. What will be the strategic posture of India over the next several decades, assuming it continues to deliver relatively high economic growth, placing it as the world's third largest economy? My sense is that Indian strategic thinking will be shaped by 6 key factors. First, a firm attachment to strategic autonomy and to preserving maximum freedom of action. Second, deep strategic competition with China, not just as a neighboring state, but also in relation to China's regional influence. Third, India is showing a growing level of comfort in increasing strategic cooperation with the US and its allies in the region, such as Japan and Australia. Fourth, India is likely to continue to support a liberal international order, although that will not extend to support for US exceptionalism. Fifth, India is committed to increase significantly its defense capability to buttress its strategic autonomy. And sixth, India is likely to be cautious about pressing a human rights agenda in its bilateral relations, and nor is it likely to be much interested in an international policy of promoting democracy. Moreover, it will hold to this caution while also holding firm to its own domestic commitment to human rights and democracy. All of this, I would suggest, creates space for Australia and India to cooperate on a shared strategic agenda. And none of these factors and these likely drivers of India's strategic trajectory create a serious problem or obstacle to such a shared agenda. Now, in suggesting that the maritime domain will become the key focus of strategic planning in the Indo-Pacific, I'm also saying that freedom of navigation will be a front-of-mind issue. China's behavior in the South China Sea is sometimes presented as a threat to freedom of navigation, but that seems to me to miss the point. China at one level has no interest in curtailing freedom of navigation, at least not commercial navigation. Military freedom of navigation is an entirely different issue for China. Indeed, if anything, part of what drives China's approach to the South China Sea is to try and ensure that it can better deal with threats to its commercial supply lines which depend on freedom of navigation. The other driver is China's wish to exert strategic control over the South China Sea, which it sees as important to its capacity to blunt US maritime superiority. These freedom of navigation issues will inevitably find an echo in the Indian Ocean, not least because it is an important waterway for international trade. And this will increase China's interest in the Indian Ocean in a way that will probably worry the United States, India, and others. So some of the major power dynamics we see playing out in the Asia-Pacific may spill over into the Indian Ocean, adding a further layer of complexity to the concept of the Indian Ocean, or of the Indian Pacific. Let me end with these comments. The re-emergence of China and India as major economies and major powers is the defining feature of our region. Their paths will be different, but the consequences of their rise will be profound. Neither will follow a linear trajectory. China's future is perhaps more uncertain because it has yet to find its settling point as a strategic power and a political system. India's challenge will be to translate potential into achievement. The Indian Ocean provides a meeting point for Australian and Indian interests in a way the Australia-China relationship cannot. It extends the scope of our growing strategic congruence. India has always seen itself as an Indian Ocean power, whereas Australia has traditionally placed a greater emphasis on the Pacific as the ultimate arbiter of our strategic stability. Now we have an opportunity to better align these perspectives and to build a partnership which bridges both oceans. It is a neat symmetry for an Australian continent which faces both the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and India, which has always been strategically anchored in its namesake ocean. Thank you.